might be the first time in a long time that you've had one of these things go off without a hitch.
Knock on, don't be.
Yeah. Okay, so let's turn to Mark 10, 32 to 45. Now they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was going before them, and they were amazed, and as they followed, they were afraid. Then he took the 12 aside again and began to tell them the things that would happen to him. Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and scourge him and spit on him and kill him. And the third day he will rise again. But James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him, saying, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. And he said to them, What do you want me to do for you? They said to him, Grant us that we may sit one on your right hand and the other on your left in your glory. But Jesus said to them, You do not know what you ask. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? They said to him, We are able. So Jesus said to them, You will indeed drink the cup that I drink, and with the baptism I am baptized with, you will be baptized. But to sit on my right hand and on my left is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it is prepared. And when the 10 heard it, they began to be greatly displeased with James and John. But Jesus called them to himself and said to them, You know that those who are considered rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them, and the great ones exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to become great among you shall be your servant. And whoever of you desires to be first shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
At Christmas time, my mother and we were visiting my mom, and one night Mom and I stayed up late watching a movie from her collection, The Monuments Men. Has anybody seen that movie? It's a wonderful movie about a group of art historians who, during the Second World War, were tasked with saving the art of the Western world from theft and destruction by the Nazis. These people risked their lives to preserve the cultural legacy of our civilization. And many of those great works were religious art, because for centuries the church was the most active patron of the arts. Humans respond to the messages of Scripture in different ways. Music, the spoken and written word, of course, we think of that all the time, but also visual. And when we view pictorial art of Christ's crucifixion, there is something that usually stands out. The placard on the cross above Jesus, stating his crime. This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now here's a question for Palm Sunday, which in history began the week that culminated in the death of Christ. And that question is, what do we mean when we talk about the death of Christ? Christ is a word that has lost its meaning. Most modern people think it's some sort of last name for Jesus. I remember, this is really an aside, but I remember a friend of mine who I was in seminary with, and when he was counseling at Camp Christie out in western Kansas, he and his kids came up with the character of Larry Christ. It was Jesus' underachieving younger brother. He became a used car salesman. Christ is not a last name. It isn't a name at all. It's a title. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Messiah, which means anointed. Kings and prophets were anointed. And Messiah, by the time Jesus came along, Messiah contained many expectations, but basically it meant king. And this is the most obvious bridge between the beginning of Holy Week and its end, because Jesus' triumphal entry, as we call it, deliberately pointed to messianic prophecies and it stirred up the hopes of the people and the fears of the politicians. Pilate agreed to crucify Jesus because of it, because of this idea. And regardless of the fact that the Roman governor was mocking the Jewish leaders in it, mocking them for their fear of this man, the declaration of Jesus' crime hung over his cross in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek stated the reason for the death sentence: the King of the Jews. And they came to him and they said, "We don't like that. Change it to, he called himself the King of the Jews." And Pilate said, "What I've written, I have written." It was Jesus' claim to kingship that made him worthy of Rome's worst punishment. For crucifixion was a political statement. It was a deterrent. Don't do what this person did. As believers multiplied, the title Christ came to have a greater and greater spiritual significance. But as hard as it is to remember, when we say Jesus Christ, we are still affirming the original criminal charge. This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. The King who suffers, who is sent from God to rule, but not by overwhelming power, by service and love and self-sacrifice. And this idea of this kind of king has so captured the hearts of the world that we have turned the cross, an instrument of death, into a symbol of healing, of the power of good over evil, and life over death. And so Christ's death eventually became one of our most frequently represented subjects in art. And today we're going to look at some of those images. Christians did not represent Jesus' death for a long time. It was still very much too close to them, and crucifixion was still a reality in their world. And as somebody, I think maybe C.S. Lewis said, nobody thought to paint a picture of crucifixion until everybody who'd ever actually seen one had died. So the first known visual depiction of Jesus' crucifixion comes from a non-believer. It's a piece of graffiti from late 1st century graffiti that was discovered in Rome. And it mocks the idea of a crucified God. This is actually one of the only visual accounts from contemporary times of the Roman practice of crucifixion. And it is actually pretty grisly in its specificity of what the person is portraying of crucifixion. And it shows the victim who's been scourged, clearly he's bleeding all over his back, but it shows him from the back because of how shameful crucifixion was. But he also gives the crucified person a donkey's head. It's mocking. And there's this man down below looking up at him, and the person drawing the graffiti wrote, "Alexamenos worships God." But over time, as pictures became important vehicles for teaching the scriptures among Christians, the scene that got portrayed the most was the worst. And today the cross is so ubiquitous that we hardly notice it. Sticking. Crosses everywhere. It's portrayed in innumerable places, from t-shirts to kitsch to films. Our society has become desensitized to violent images, so the tendency has become to overemphasize in modern Christian art and literature and movies the gory aspects of crucifixion, as if everybody needs to be told how horrible this was. And I found myself very unwilling to use in church some of the modern images of crucifixion I was finding because they were so violent. But even with this inundation of images, we still find so many great works of art that are profound theology that provoke our minds to think and our hearts to feel. The exterior wood doors of Santa Sabina Church in Rome have one of the earliest existing artistic depictions of the crucifixion, from roughly 430 AD. It is familiar but different. The crosses have not yet taken their iconic shape, and it gives the impression of an execution in a public area, not a hill outside the city. Jesus is placed between the two thieves, but is much bigger than they are. This is called hierarchical scaling, where you use size to emphasize what is most important in the picture. At the same time, it's a very human depiction by people who maybe still had some recollection of what crucifixion would have been like. It increases our sense of Jesus as one of us, human. But at the same time, the scaling subtly emphasizes his difference from us. The Italian Renaissance, with its advances in artistic technique, produced many of our most beloved works of sacred art. And one of the great early works of this era is Crocifixion by Giotto di Bondone. Giotto was known for psychological depth. To one side, uninterested in the death they have administered, soldiers argue over Jesus' realm. On the other side are his friends, absolutely distraught. The angels flying about in the sky, if you look closely, are weeping, inconsolable. And this great work of art captures the idea of both heaven and earth overcome with grief. Yet the bright blue sky and the tranquility of the dying Savior hint that all is not lost. Matthias Grunewald's famous crucifixion scene from the Eisenheim altarpiece, which I recall was one of the works that was rescued by the monuments men. It has no subtle tranquility. This painting depicts agony and death shrouded in overwhelming darkness. Its twisted, contorted victim shows an almost morbid interest in physical suffering. Jesus' body is covered with small wounds and punctured by thorns broken from his crown. But the painting also contains poignant symbolism. A lamb's blood pouring into a chalice, reminding us of the Eucharist. This is my blood poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. And John the Baptist pointing to the cross, saying, "Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world." The late Renaissance artist Jacopo Tintoretto portrayed huge, dramatic scenes on great big canvases, and he used light to direct attention within them. In his crucifixion scene, we might easily be overwhelmed by the sheer chaos of it. There's so much going on. Workers, horses, soldiers gambling, passers-by gawking. Yet in the center, Jesus rises above it all, light radiating from him, giving us an aura of authority. And as he told Pilate, "You would have no authority over me at all if it had not been given you from above." Tintoretto's painting is loud and dramatic. The 17th century Spanish painter El Greco's Christ on the Cross is quiet and subtle. The unique elongated figure of Jesus, the twisting clouds, the otherworldly light give a sense of the divine breaking into the physical world, making a statement that the earthly and the heavenly are not separate, but are intimately intertwined, in letting us know God is present. Paul Gauguin's 1889 painting, The Yellow Christ, brings us to the advent of modern art. Gauguin, like many of us, struggled with questions of ultimate meaning. And so his crucified Christ appears as a question. It is jarringly placed in a calm pastoral setting, surrounded by pious, dignified rural women praying around cross. But if you look at the back, there's a thief escaping over the wall of the field. What is that? What question is that asking? This painting says, as hard as it is for those who are comfortable with how things are, Jesus always challenges us. He doesn't leave us comfortable. And for those who are used to traditional depictions of Christ's crucifixion, this picture is very strange. Yet traditional is not the same thing as historical. Over and over in art, literature, and film, tradition gets in the way of history. You can be pretty sure that many of your cherished images of Christ's crucifixion are traditional, not real. Even today in historical documentaries and religious movies, you see these depictions that are using things that emerged centuries after these events from people who knew very little about what they were portraying, except they knew its meaning. And that brings us to the 20th century and Georgia O'Keeffe's 1929 Black Cross. Now, if you're familiar with Georgia O'Keeffe, most likely you're familiar with her paintings of flowers, which are full of vibrant colors. There are no vibrant colors. Everything is muted here with just a thin sliver of crimson on the horizon, and the cross fills the picture, obscuring the sky, awesome, foreboding, perhaps evoking the hour after Christ has been taken down from the cross and all hope seems lost. Our final picture brings us full circle to the opening question. What do we mean when we refer to the death of Christ? Marc Chagall was a Russian-born artist of Jewish descent. He lived through both world wars, which were times of great persecution of the Jews. The cross is usually seen by Jews as a symbol of persecution and oppression. Yet in White Cross, it represents their suffering. Chagall painted it in 1938 in response to Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, an anti-Jewish pogrom decreed by Joseph Goebbels. Homes, businesses, and synagogues throughout German territory were systematically vandalized or destroyed, and thousands of Jews were carted off to concentration camps, beginning that horrific time of persecution. This painting shows a world literally turned upside down, houses flipped over, flames tearing through synagogues, people covering their eyes in horror. Chagall places the crucified Christ in the midst of these atrocities. And Jesus is shown with the traditional halo and the light that cuts through the terror. Yet in a powerful gesture of solidarity, Chagall reminds us of his Jewish identity because the familiar cloth draped around his waist is a Hebrew prayer shawl. There is the familiar inscription above his head. And often in Western art, you may have noticed that the three languages are ignored. And only Latin is used. INRI, Jesu Nazareum, Rex Judaeum. That was done over and over again through the centuries, partly just for convenience, because it's easier than painting three languages, but mostly because of the cultural domination of Rome over the Western world for 1,500 years. But that placard was inscribed for a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual crowd in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Christ on the cross, suffering for the world, is not a king who will lend his authority to any cause of violence or prejudice or hate. And the painting reminds us that real Christian faith has social consequences. Faith by itself without works is dead. We've been hearing that over and over the last few weeks as I talked about James. And as 1 John 1:29 declares, whoever says he is in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. So art does more than remind us of historical events. It helps guide us through them. And it helps guide us through the meaning of those events, the meaning of our faith, and the mystery of our faith. It helps us deal with questions that are rolling around inside our own hearts and minds and think about them and ultimately find the meaning that is within the mystery of new life that comes after suffering if we give ourselves to Him the way He gave Himself to us. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give Himself a ransom for many. Yet, Lord, we would serve You. Amen. Where did I put my notes? Oh, there it is. It fell in. Our closing song, and you can remain seated while we sing it, is Amazing Love, Oh What Sacrifice.